Welcome. Thank you all for coming. And thanks for Laura for making all this possible. Where is Laura, by the way? Has she disappeared completely? All right, good. I feel more, space is more secure when Laura is around. That's the way we feel about it. We all agree. And when Erin is around, we're completely secure. I'm Sam Visner. I'm the chair of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. I'm not going to give you all that much about my background. I've run a couple of cybersecurity businesses, chief of SIGINT programs at the National Security Agency. My obituary has been published on LinkedIn. You can look it up there, so please go and do that. Joining me today are Lesley Conn from the Space Foundation and George Pullen, who is an economist. Try to be nice to him because being an economist is not always the most popular thing. But we don't have as many economist jokes as we have lawyer jokes. But there's still time. Day ain't over. Well, thank you all, and thanks for coming. The topic that we want to explore today is why securing space is important from the perspective of the economy of our country, of the countries that are our allies and partners, and the global economy. And I want to be clear about something that is not always made explicitly clear. And that is that the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center was established from its very beginning, from its inception, with the concept of collective defense, and that it would be a global endeavor. So countries that are working with us, Japan, United Kingdom, United States, Israel, Taiwan, France, Greece, Germany, Canada, Australia, and if I've missed somebody, I apologize. These are countries that share basic values and share a basic economic system, an economic system that depends increasingly on the space environment. So our ambition from the very beginning was to build a global space ecosystem that would be secure for our partners and our allies, that would be secure as well in such a way that it would encourage the development of good normative behavior worldwide, perhaps behavior that even adversaries, or as somebody said recently, the bad countries, would be forced over time to adopt. One of the drivers for getting this done is the value of the economy, of the global economy and of our national economies that is derived from space. I have very specific views on this, but I'd like to start by asking, what are your perspectives about how we should look at how we should measure the value of the space economy? What direct measures might be useful for us in this analysis? And I have my own view as well. George, let me start with you.
Sure. So I think one of the things that's really important to start with when we're talking about space economy estimates is to make sure that we're taking into account all of the secondary and tertiary impacts that space has. It is too surface level for us to only focus on the amount of economic activity coming out of launch, coming out of the number of satellites that are in orbit, or coming out of something like GPS, which everyone is probably very familiar with and might have used to get here today if you're in person. It's important that we also include other metrics. We have to think about the scientific second-order impacts. We have to think about something that I've said for a long time, which is that biotech will be the killer app of space. The killer app analogy is something that we've seen talked about pretty often among Silicon Valley folks with reference to SaaS and more recently AI. But if you think about the way the space economy works, if you're only ever measuring economic activity by have we had more launches or have we put more satellites up, you're missing the bigger picture because that can never be a self-licking ice cream cone. We have to have a space economy that also delivers value back to other sectors of the economy. And for me personally, I think keeping a very close eye on biotech is an important place to start and to drive some of those numbers from.
I think that's a very good insight, and one that is not necessarily given enough attention. That is the connection of space to other very specific sectors, including biotech. Lesley, what is your view? How can we measure the value of the space economy? We always say that it's critical, but just how critical is it?
Well, it is very critical not only to how we live our lives today, but I would agree for the potential that it represents. So what we've done at the Space Foundation through the Space Report for almost 20 years is to look at least what those strong foundational markets are, but then to also look beyond that. I think certainly there could be analyses done that I've seen some that take it all the way down to what soft drink companies will do from a logistical tracking standpoint. So I think there's some medium territory there, but certainly in terms of an economic driver, space is vitally important now, but the potential that is being represented in microgravity research, in what can happen in terms of cislunar communications, the potential that we're seeing in terms of lunar exploration and the potential that might be there. When you look at alternative fuels, this is really, I think, the new proving ground for many new economies that will have global impact and global economic prosperity.
Well, the way that you're both putting it suggests to me an analytic framework, but one that's not going to be easy to employ. And I would think of it as maybe in 4 components. One would be the direct value of the space industry, building, launching, operating space systems. I think, knock on, I think a termite had starved to death here. But I think one might be able to measure that. And there's talk that could reach $1 trillion by the end of the decade. I think it's likely to reach $1 trillion more like by 2027 or 2028. The second is, what is the dependencies of space on essentially on other infrastructures? So the example, if we lose space, what happens to shipping? If we lose space, what happens to communication? If we lose space, what happens to energy? If we lose space, what happens to any of the other sectors, all of the critical infrastructure sectors that spend on space? What would be their economic losses? I think they would be significant, but I don't know that we have yet developed the means to measure that. The third component is, if we really were to lose our access to space, have a day without space, and I think Space Force has conducted an exercise, what would be the effect on our national economies? The national economy of Germany, the national economy of Israel, the national economy of the United States, of France, of our other partners. How significant would that be? That would be a third order of analysis. And I think I'd be curious to get your thoughts as to how we might chew our way into that problem. And just to make it more complicated, there are all the new industries that Lesley was talking about that will emerge that might not emerge if we lost our access to space. Manufacturing in space, cislunar operations in space, mining in space, manufacturing in biotech under microgravity. So understanding the metrics associated with those 4 things seems to me it's going to be a pretty difficult but interesting challenge. But one, if we fail to meet it, we won't necessarily make the investment in securing space that we should. George, over to you.
So one of the things that Milky Economy has put out for a while now is our $4 trillion by the 2040s estimate for the size of the space economy. That's much bigger than some of the other estimates out there, but I personally feel the other estimates are wrong. And so $4 trillion by the 2040s, growing to $10 trillion by the 2050s. And some people in the room might already be familiar that the $10 trillion by the 2050s number is actually in line with the Chinese Space Agency's number. They also believe it's a $10 trillion future economy in the 2050s, okay? Now, how do you get to those numbers? So let's take one step back and then talk about your question here, which is, how do we get these economic forecasts right? So one of the tools that we use in economics, and especially if we bring in our sister science, finance, which then you're really making friends if you're a finance guy and an economist, right? But putting on our financial econometric hats for a second, one of the things we'll do is a cost-benefit analysis. And we'll say, what's the cost of our substitute good? Right? So if we did not have space, if we did not have access to space or the space resource that provides these economic functions and activities, what is our next alternative and what's the cost of that next alternative, right? So for many things, the answer is hard because the answer is there isn't a next alternative. And so in a cost-benefit analysis, when your next alternative doesn't exist, that means the replacement cost becomes infinite. Now, I'm not saying that the value of the space economy is infinite, right? That's more of a Star Trek thing. But what I am saying is that when you're pricing out models like this, that's how you have to think about them, because it's the cost of the substitute good, right? If we were denied access to all of our satellites tomorrow, what's the cost of that? Well, that means that we'd have to use our deep sea cables way more than we are now. Well, the deep sea cables are already pretty full. So now what do? Where's that excess go? Well, now we have to make complicated decisions about which data is important enough or which data is not important enough to travel in those other alternative routes. The same thing with shipping, right? If we have limited access to space and therefore we have to start deciding who has access to something like GPS, which let's all hope that doesn't happen, but if we have to start deciding, who has access to GPS and who doesn't in this fictitious scenario, then you start running into situations where it's like, well, do I need to make sure that that cargo ship knows where it's going, or do I need to make sure that the oil tanker knows where it's going, or do I need to make sure that Fred knows how the quickest way to get to the hospital is to get his son there because he just got stung by a bee and he's allergic? Those are hard decisions, which right now we don't have to make, but if you don't have an alternative, that's the situation you get forced into.
But I think one other thing that you can look at is if that scenario were to happen, and again, we all knock on something, hope that that doesn't happen, but the lack of having an asset that we've all become so dependent on, I think could become an additional economic trigger where you would see, if the conditions were correct, you would see such a global response, and you'd see so much more invested into NASA budget, into restoring launch capabilities, into looking at, what spaceport development do we have? So I think really the interesting question is, certainly we here and many in this audience recognize the value of space. I think if you go one or two audiences outside that, is there still enough common recognition of just what space does on a daily economic basis? And if there were some kind of situation like that, I think that's where you would have a much greater global understanding and then renewed investment in space.
I agree with that point, and it raises a thought as I was trying to complicate the question of doing an analysis of the value of the space economy. It occurred to me that I was being simplistic in my analysis in any case. There's maybe another area that Lesley, you just made me think about, and that is the value of the space economy to driving science and technological advancement and development. It's a forcing function. We're going to be developing new energy sources from space, potentially beaming via microwave energy down. Companies like BWXT are developing small nuclear reactors for spacecraft, which is going to lead to advanced development of small and modular reactors here on the ground. In fact, I've been telling my wife I thought maybe we needed an SMR for the house. And she thought the neighbors would really like that idea. But in any case, if you think about all of the advances in biotech, in aerospace, in energy production, in optics, in remote sensing, in every other technology. And I think I spent last week at a conference in Tokyo called Cybertech that was co-sponsored by Japanese and Israeli partners. Well, think about that combination. Those are two technologically adept, technologically entrepreneurial countries. These are countries that are looking at the role of cybersecurity and the role of space, not just because it's good for their national security, though it is. It's absolutely important. But it's also, I think, very much a driver of the technological entrepreneurship and innovation for which those two countries in particular are known. One last and maybe even a sixth element is this. More and more our national security systems depend on commercial space systems today. Where are we buying our imagery? Companies like Planet and Maxar have more imaging satellites in orbit than any government does. What is that? How do we impute value to some of those things? And so I'm curious, how do we look at the value to national security? Is there a dollar value to that? And, oh, by the way, how do we look at the value of space and the need to secure space in terms of future science and technology, the development of which is not always easy to foresee?
Okay, so I'll take the second part of the question first, which is the science and technology development that's coming down the road for us, right? I think what we have to think about is if we're talking about science and technology that's developing 5 years later, 10 years later, we have to be realistic with each other and apply a discount, right? Because the way it works when you do any sort of estimation or modeling, it doesn't matter if you're involved with private equity or your own forecast for the future. If something is happening in 10 years from now, you're going to discount its value versus something that's going to happen tomorrow, right? If I told you I could give you $100 today or $1,000 in 10 years, which one would you take? Well, that's based on your discount formula. And so as much as I believe in our Star Trek future, I think that we have to discount its value today, right? We have to think about what are the next most likely technologies that we will not be competitive on as allied nations if we don't have space and we don't have assured space access. And I think that comes down to really the core 4 tenets of our current industrial revolution, right? It's access to big data. So this goes back to your imagery points, right? So much of this data is imagery. It goes back to our connectivity to healthcare and biotech, right? Are the biomedical sciences able to access platforms that they need, such as the ISS, to conduct experiments on? If they lack that access, that impacts their ability to make those experiments happen and then bring those medical cures and potions back, right? Your third is fintech, and believe it or not, the financial markets very much function on a matter of speed. And so if they can have greater speed and better accuracy based on either data from space or data relays from space, they will 100% be using that for payments, et cetera. And then the fourth component, which we shouldn't overlook, is of course not just nuclear, but also new energy in general, right? So even if we're talking about the tracking of emissions or the deforestation patterns, all that comes from data from space. And so if you're not tapping into all 4 of these things, that's where it gets muddied, right? Because these 4 are immediate. These are 4 current trends. And so space's ability to help and amplify those trends and make the economic wins happen domestically or those with our partners, that's where it lies for me. For the first part of the question, I'll pause for a second. I'll let Lesley go, but I have a couple thoughts there too.
Well, I will say, without hopefully getting too dark and twisty here, but I think currently what we're seeing in terms of global space access and activity is at least a fairly level playing field. There's still, good access for those who can align. I think one of the things that we're starting to see, the attention that is ramping up, certainly from a national security standpoint, is we need the national security investment in order to ensure that all have access to that. If that national security component were to be removed, I think very quickly we could then start looking at very stark differences in terms of continued access to space. I think one balance, though, that we also have to look at while we're examining that is as we invest more and more in national security, again, an important component, but what happens to the balance of the science and the technology and the truly emerging profound effects that we might discover through science and technology? And now I'm curious to know what your first part is.
So for my first part, I look at national security through 2 lenses, right? The first is I was once and will always be a Marine, even though it's been many years. So I look at it from that point of view, but then I also look at it from the point of view of buying down risk. So I also wear my banker hat when I think about national security. And so if I know that national security and information sharing, things like Space ISAC, who's hosting, right? If I know that they're buying down my risk, that they're participating in my ability to participate in this market commercially, that matters, right? Because I can only insure away so much risk. I can hedge away some other parts of risk. But when it comes to national security, what's spent there buys down that third bucket of risk that as a commercial participant, I don't really have much choice over. So I have to know that the national defense spend is adequate to buy down that risk for me, particularly if I'm a commercial participant where dual use is involved, right? You mentioned Planet, Maxar, there are plenty of others, where if my risk isn't bought down, then how do I participate in a market where I have investors? and those investors have other alternatives for their money. And if I don't see a situation where national security interests are bringing down that component of my risk portfolio, I'll spend my money elsewhere.
That gives me a thought that I'm not all that comfortable with, but I'm going to try it out anyway. I used to study, because my father was a nuclear physicist, I used to study the question of nuclear deterrence. And nuclear deterrence relies a lot on stability, signaling, transparency, understanding. This is what I'm going to do. Don't you do anything I won't understand. I'm not going to do anything you won't understand. I know where my red lines are. Don't you cross them. You know where your red lines are. I'm not going to cross them. We understand these things. And by having signaling and good predictability, we've managed to achieve a sort of healthier global economy. One of the things I think I just heard you say, George, is that it's time for us to have more transparency and more predictability in our investment in space for a couple of reasons. First, it helps buy down risk. And second, it helps buy down the risk of war. If people understand that the space systems that we use for deterrence are secure, then they are deterred. If they don't think they are secure, if they think they can be attacked, if they think that they can be undermined, then war becomes more likely. That's a way of not buying down the risk. I'm wondering if there's a way to impute any value to that. Now, that's something that planners at ministries of defense in Paris and Canberra and London and elsewhere have to figure out. But I do think it's actually worth understanding the extent to which the security of space systems is important to international security. As an example, by the way, I will note that when Russia invaded Ukraine, they did not, they did not send their boots over the border as the first shot fired. What did they do? What was the first thing they did? That's right. There was a cyber attack on Viasat, the commercial satellite system on which Ukraine depended. They knew that if they could disable the command and control of the civilian and civil economy in Ukraine, this would give them an advantage. And so that's the first thing they did. It didn't give them a decisive advantage, fortunately, but it was something they did. So understanding the value of space to national security, I think, is vitally important. And I think it should, in fact, be used as a driver for the investment. Thoughts?
Well, absolutely. And as to George's point, investors want assurances and security and confidence in where they are placing their money. And fortunately, what we've seen in the last 12 months is some really impressive return of private investment into the space industry. And what we're hearing now, I always love it when an economist will agree with me, like on stage. That was not practiced at all. So yes, we are seeing that. We anticipate that clearly for the next year, we will continue to see that strong investment. But again, it's really about the signal that is sent. If there are concerns that their place of business is not protected and secure, to George's point, they will look elsewhere. I think one other point that we can talk about is that the more national security investment there is in partnership with commercial companies, that provides those commercial companies, for lack of a better phrase, a line of business. And with government contracts tending to be long-term contracts, that does give commercial space some confidence, some stability where, yes, they could deliver here, but would that also allow them some bandwidth to continue in some other work that perhaps would have larger scientific and technological benefit?
I think there's something there that you hit on that I want to go into a bit more, which is we've had some fantastic returns in space over the last 12 months. And one of the conversations that we have a lot in economic circles is, does commerce follow the flag, or does flag follow commerce? And this is an expression that has its roots back, hundreds of years. But essentially, if you apply it to space, what you can see is that as governments spend more on space, commercial entities are also willing to follow and spend more on space. So there's really a following of the flag, right? A following of national interest, whether those be security, scientific, or otherwise, through commercial participation going up. And I think we're seeing that right now over these last 12 months.
So what do you think are the risks to the impediments to investment in space? Any investment environment is lumpy. People always talking about buy land because they're not making any more of it. But, although they may be, we'll see. We on the moon. But on the other hand, even the real estate market can be lumpy. One of the questions I would ask is, what are the impediments to investing in space? What are the risks, not only of an investment in space, but what might make space investment more difficult, less likely to occur?
I think a good portion of that is really predictability, and also the level of business acumen that is being demonstrated by some of these companies. So one of the things we saw in 2020 to 2023 was perhaps a real uptick in startup companies, a lot of money being pushed toward it. But a lot of these companies, while they may have had the great idea and they perhaps were fabulous engineers, didn't have the kind of long-term business prospectus that someone from a economic or finance standpoint would look for. And so I think it's predictability and stability are two main factors there.
I think another thing that we should all think about is, as space investments are something that everyone in this room is probably very interested in, if we think out past this room, we have to remember that dollars compete, right? So dollars aren't black, they're not white, they're not red, white, or blue, they're green. And that means they'll go wherever they can make the most of themselves. And so your money doesn't care, right? Your money doesn't care if it's space or it's cool or anything like that. They just care that they're getting the best return, risk adjusted, that they can. And so that's why I really want to just circle back to this whole buying down risk, right? When governments lead, it buys down risk. When national security is high, it buys down risk. When political stability exists, it buys down risk, particularly for things like space. But we just have to remember that because our dollars compete, right now those dollars for space are competing with AI. We all knew the word was going to happen sometime today. And it's $1 billion a day going into artificial intelligence, right? That's a conservative estimate from some of the stuff I've read. And so we have to remember that those $1 billion, not all of them, but some of them per day could have been coming into space, but they didn't. They chose to go to AI. We have to keep in mind that because dollars compete, if we don't make ourselves look competitive, whether these be small or medium-sized firms like you were talking about, or even larger firms that are publicly traded, and yes, there's not that many publicly traded pure space plays, but they're competing against every other company out there for those dollars, because the managers of that money, whether they be family offices or Wall Street bankers, they have other choices, right? And very, very few have a mandate to just do space. They could do a number of other things. And so if you're not competitive on a risk-adjusted basis, then the money won't flow to those areas.
Well, I think that's part of what we are starting to see in terms of the increased investment activity, is that companies such as those, whether they're family-owned, private, they are starting to see some stability, some lower cost of doing business. And so for them, they're starting to enter this market and saying, okay, now could be the time. So companies that traditionally have not been involved in space are starting to see, enough stability, enough return on investment that they are willing to enter the market. Any type of black swan event, any kind of, economic disruption could affect that.
I understand. One thing that has happened as a result of this, of course, is that the cost of getting a kilogram to orbit has gone down enormously, and the capability of a kilogram on orbit has gone up enormously. This must be having an effect on the space economy, not just as it's creating a demand for it. Not only is it creating a healthier launch services business, again, we hope, and I think it is, but is it also creating the ability for other companies not in the launch business, but to take advantage of the launch business, to leverage that and say, well, an investment in space would have been risky before because it was too expensive to get my payload up there and it might blow up anyway on the launch pad. Now it's not likely to blow up on the launch pad, and it is easy, and it's a lot less expensive to get up there. Is that acting as an accelerator to the space economy? Is there a way of measuring that?
I think that we are beginning to see that. Absolutely. Just from one quick example you can cite is just the number of companies that are beginning to invest in Earth observation. You know, for so long, it largely has been a government function. Half a dozen companies easily, I think we could list, that are now putting assets in space, very quickly getting up to speed, and are understanding markets that want very specialized data, not only about climate information, but about natural disaster detection, you know, wildfire detection. So to see half a dozen companies that are already beginning to enter that market and compete, I think is one good example of the benefit of reducing launch costs, having more off-the-shelf application that can then be deployed into space. I think we're barely scratching the surface of the potential.
I think if we talk about the reductions in launch cost, we obviously have to realize that those reductions in launch costs and the rapidity of launch has enabled more things to get up into space, right? And more kilograms to get up into space in an affordable way. But we also have to keep in mind that we still operate outside of the idealized free market, right? The idealized free market is many sellers and many buyers. It's easy to enter or exit a market, right? We've all remember Econ 101. And so in our market, though, we have a monopsony-like player, right? And then we have a monopoly-like player, right? So for monopsonies, that's someone who is providing the majority of the signal on one side of the market, and the monopoly is someone who's providing the majority of the signal on the other side of the market, right? So even though space is maturing and we are removing some of these factors, we still have a predominant provider of supply and a predominant provider of demand. And so it's not an idealized free market yet, right? But it has created enough room for more participation. I think the other thing too is, and you were talking about Earth observation data, and one of the things I like to share is there was a number of companies out there, and no one has to raise their hands, but I know statistically speaking, at least half of the gentlemen in the room probably have a gambling app on their phone. Luckily, women are less prone to gambling. And so there are right now companies out there selling data on the number of cars in parking lots for NFL games and the number of cars in parking lots for practices in the preseason. So they know which players are there and if they're practicing, if they're healthy or not, and then they're using that data to build back statistical algorithms that tell them whether they're more or less likely to win their next game. Access to data from space has a lot of great uses, and I'm not saying if this is a good one or not, but what it lets us do is create all these new markets and all these new businesses can have access to this data to create products. And again, I'm not condoning that product, but what I'm trying to make clear is that if it wasn't as cheap as it is today to get things up into space, based on your question, or if it wasn't as easy for corporations today to buy that imagery data, you would never see a product like that, right? 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Each image would have cost millions of dollars. But now, it's affordable enough that if you so wanted to, increase your odds, you can subscribe to something like that.
I think that's also a really good example, though, of the unanticipated markets that can develop from space technology.
Oh, absolutely. I hadn't really thought of that. And no, I don't think I have a gambling app on my phone.
Who would have thought of that in 1957 or 1963 even, or maybe even 1984?
Well, no, not at all. Let me ask another question that's been on my mind. We talk in the Space ISAC about collective defense of the space systems environment among allies and partners. But we're not the only actors in space. China has clearly developed an ambition to equal and surpass the United States as the leader in space. And they have not only the ambition to do so, but they believe they can. And they're working hard to do it. They are also building a space launch business and a commercial space launch business. I'm wondering what effect that will have on the value of the space economy and oh, by the way, on risk to that space economy. They're not the only ones building it, by the way. India has a very robust space program. They've landed on the moon. They've done asteroid exploration. They've developed both a set of ambitions and a capability to begin to match up to those ambitions. Other countries who are not necessarily either members of the space ISAC or, in the case of China and Russia, still have robust space programs that are competitive. And in the case of China, they're building a commercial space program. I can't comment on its links to the government. They're probably fairly close. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of entrepreneurs in China who are as motivated by entrepreneurial reward as anybody else. What do we think that is going on in terms of their contribution to the space economy and the opportunities and risks that that might pose?
Well, I'm going to jump in first here because I know that George will provide a more layered answer as a follow-up to this. But I think one of the first things to look at is, yes, we are all well aware of the robust nature that China is taking. I think a second thing to look at, though, really goes to in the marketplace, if your choice is limited, but you want your dollars to go somewhere and you see the economic potential, say in microgravity research, if your choice is so limited, eventually you are going to go with the choice that you have. And we're already seeing that in terms of China's space station, that other nations, some who are Artemis signatories, have already signed on to do research because they feel it is the best bet that they have. So yes, China can continue to be an economic driver. We do see what India is doing as well. I think there is more attention and more discussion happening with the United States and its allies. I think it's about response time and pacing.
So I think one of the main reasons that Milky Way Economy's forecast is bigger than some of the banks or consultancies' forecasts is because we see Chinese space activity being a major contributor to overall space economic development in the 2040s and 2050s. And if we are all honest with each other, we realize that there is a possible future scenario where the only commercially available space station, or space station at all, available in the next decade will be the Tiangong, or the Tiangong 2, right, when they put up their second one. There's also a very likely future scenario where you had 7 SpaceX clones, more or less, all funded in China over the last decade. 3 of them are looking to be quite successful these days, right? That ensures a level of access to space that we don't even have. And so if those trends continue, you have a space economy that is growing. It's just that our percentage of it isn't growing as fast as their percentage of it. And that also means that partners engaged with sciences and other activities will have to make some pretty tough choices on where they want to have their laboratories done, where they want to do their advanced research in circuits or chips in microgravity, where they want to develop new drugs. Do they want to wait for the United States to put up a commercial space station, or are they going to take their chances and do it on the Chinese space station? I think businesses will have to make business decisions, but I think we all know some of them will make the second decision there.
What about the contribution of other countries? Another Space ISAC members do include Japan. The Japanese Space Agency, I think, was our first international partner, as I recall. The French Space Agency, I was down in Toulouse meeting a few months ago with the Centre National des Études Spatiales, the French Space Agency. Very impressive program, very impressive people. Germany, DLR, and is working very hard. The UK Space Agency, the Israeli Space Agency, which is a smaller effort but is impressive technologically. The Taiwan Space Agency. All of these are, I think, working to carve out a role in the global space economy. What do we think of their contribution to the global space economy? How significant is it? How serious is it? What might it look like in future? And I don't know, by the way, if we're going to have time for Q&A, but if we will, some of our partners are here and they may want to allot us. We'll have 5 minutes for Q&A, I'm told. Pardon? 5 left. So we have in our 5 minutes left, what do we think about our global partners?
I'll do a 30-second answer so we have time for Q&A. So my 30-second answer is, if you follow the money, you have about $120 billion that is spent on space across all governments across the entire globe. Out of that 120 billion, upwards of 70 billion is the US. So the answer is we're spending a lot, and all of our partner spends is fantastic, but we just have to make sure that we follow the money and that we realize how much of this percentage spending is coming from the US. And of course, the next biggest spender is China.
I'm going to jump in really quickly and maybe do 20 seconds. Another thing, though, that we have to look at is because of recent geopolitical situations, we are seeing some nations and groups of nations, such as Europe, really making fundamental changes in how they look at space, how they are structuring themselves, and the amount of money that they are willing to invest. You're also seeing that in Africa and Latin American regions. Certainly not to the extent of the United States and China right now, but there are big changes coming as these nations recognize the value of space.
Well, I guess that accords with the impression that I have from talking with people and reading media, that countries don't want to be left behind, that if countries are not involved in the space economy, that by 2030, 2040, 2050, there really is going to be another sort of class break in terms of countries that are and countries that are not first world, second world, third world, but countries that are spacefaring and frankly countries that are not, that we're really are going to have more difficulty counting in the international system given the importance of space both to geopolitics and to the economy. I'm told we're down to something like 3 minutes. Can we take a few questions from the audience? And if so, may we have them? And I guess we can get a microphone in front of you. I know it's Monday. I know it's in the morning.
George is
and please
really
identify
eager to
yourself
answer
if
questions.
you would.
Look, he's alert.
Good morning, panel. It's Kev Jones from CGI, UK and Australia. You wanted an international perspective, so I thought I'd start the questions. I wanted to pick up on a comment, Lesley, you made right at the top of this session in terms of carrying the narrative or shaping the narrative to win the argument. And I think what we find, I suspect everybody in this room would agree wholeheartedly what everybody said on the panel this morning. But we need to shape the narrative and carry the argument outside of this room. And I'm wondering whether focusing on, we talk about value, focusing on 1 trillion, 3 trillion, 10 trillion, it's useful but potentially not helpful to create the right narrative to the broader society in terms of thinking about how we, as a set of collaborative nations, are going to drive forward, secure our way of life, advance it, but most importantly, secure it, become more resilient. So I'm wondering whether there's a common framework. George mentioned frameworks earlier on. Common framework or maybe a common taxonomy that we can use to better articulate what the value of the space domain actually provides to the other sectors. Given that we're still in a geocentric argument, geopolitics are playing a huge card here. So if we started talking about integrated reporting, if we started talking about other capitals of value, because all we've talked about is the financial capital of value, there's an intellectual capital of value, there's a social, technical capital, there's a physical, there's a natural capital that might provide the language that we can carry that narrative to the broader society that will start to understand and appreciate actually what space, nationally and internationally, can deliver to the rest of the economy and therefore to society's way of life. I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Well, and I think you raise an excellent point there. What I would say is talking about the global space economy from a financial, economic standpoint, that is one talking point. That is one way to engage in audiences who, might pay attention to a big number. But there are many other ways, you're right, that we should continue, and we do engage in trying to talk about other elements of space. For example, what Redwire and other companies are doing in terms of tissue and science development on ISS. The fact that they see within 10 years that we could grow organs in space and end organ donation, that is also a huge talking point, not only from an economic driver standpoint, but how it could fundamentally change life on Earth. I mean, imagine if we no longer had to have an organ donation list. So I think there are ways like that we can still spark imagination and talk about what space is doing. Certainly when we look at, nuclear energy and how it potentially could start out as a moon application, but then come back to Earth, that's another way. AI, we're all mad and crazy for it now, but we probably haven't had enough conversation around how really AI was born so much out of what space was doing, out of the long-range missions, out of the vast amounts of data that our telescopes are returning that AI analyzes, and how, the autonomous driving that we're all doing now really began with Mars rovers. So I think there's a lot of conversation around how do we better tell that story, but there are several storylines about space, and I think finance and the economy is just one storyline.
I would say that just to give a fuller picture, in addition to Milky Way economy and the consultative work I do, I also teach, and one of the things that comes up quite a bit is the connection between space and ESG and UN SDGs. And so these are the environmental, social, and good governance standards, right? And I will tell you, every classroom I have with young people, that covers 2 different lectures, right? They want to understand how that connects to space, how space plays with it, and how space plays off of it. And so I think you're right. I think when we leave these rooms, we have to make sure that we have the right narrative, particularly for each other, but also for the people coming behind us, so that they're also involved with space and know to care about its value outside of maybe just the money, because of course as a money guy, that's what I focused on.
And we haven't really even touched on the risk to the space economy from the lack of the STEM workforce. We could do another session. I know we're at time, but I'll take one more question if there is one from the audience. Enough of you people are technical. You don't like to speak publicly. Come on. And please identify yourself if you'd be so kind. Thank you.
All these things are great, but I spend most of my days in government offices and with commercial dual-use technology companies. Please give me your opinion on how we're overcoming the acquisition hurdle we still face with the government.
There's the old joke about the genie who when asked about fixing acquisition, says, wouldn't you like a highway from San Francisco to Hawaii? Something easy. I've, for better or worse, and probably not for better, I have been talking with the acquisition community, so I'll take this one if you don't mind. This is going to be really hard. There is a very embedded set of practices and capabilities and traditions and perhaps even tribal behavior associated with how we do acquisition. The good news is that it actually has resulted in systems that really work pretty well. The bad news is it takes so long to deliver many of these systems that it can be an impediment to the environment. I know that the current administration is trying to focus on ways to streamline things. I do believe that what the commercial space sector has done represents in some ways a model of new ways of coupling system development, systems engineering, and acquisition to speed that cycle. It's my hope that we will learn some of these lessons in time to actually be as competitive as we need to be. Whether or not that'll prove to be true is something, frankly, I don't know, but I wish it would happen. I'm going to close the panel at this time. I would like to thank our sponsors. I'd like to thank STAX, the Space ISAC, Amentum for playing such an important role here, and my panelists, Lesley and George. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.